There comes a moment in every woman's life when the world decides she has nothing left to offer. For Evelyne Thorne, that moment arrived when her village put her up for auction to save themselves from starvation. The 52-year-old widow stood on the platform, knowing she was considered worthless, too old for bearing children, too worn for heavy labor. But when the bidding began, only one voice called out through the mist. Lord Veyran, the vampire lord who ruled these mountains for centuries, claimed her with gold that could feed the village for years. Everyone expected him to drag her away in chains. Instead, he knelt at her feet and asked for her help. Why would the most feared creature in the realm bow before a woman society had thrown away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered stone platform where Evelyne had stood, just hours before, still bore the scuff marks from her worn boots. The auction block, as it had come to be known in whispered conversations, had witnessed 3 centuries of desperate bargains. Carved from mountain granite by hands long dead, it stood in the center of Ravenshollow's main square, like a tombstone marking the death of dignity. Evelyne's healing satchel, now clutched against her chest in Veyran's obsidian carriage, held the weight of 40 years of service to a community that had ultimately betrayed her. The worn leather bag had been her constant companion through births and deaths, plagues and harvests. Inside, dried herbs rustled with each bump of the road, chamomile for sleepless nights, willow bark for pain, foxglove for failing hearts. Each remedy told a story of someone she had helped, someone who had needed her skilled hands and gentle voice. But skills and gentleness meant nothing when hunger gnawed at a village's belly and war pressed against its borders. Ravenshollow perched on the edge of civilization like a bird on a cliff, always one strong wind away from tumbling into the abyss. The village had survived 200 years by being too poor to raid and too remote to conquer. Its people grew thin, crops in rocky soil, and raised scraggly goats that gave more attitude than milk. They endured because they had no choice, and they endured together because alone meant death. That unity had cracked when Lord Blackwood's armies swept down from the northern passes, demanding tribute the village could not pay. Then Lord Aramis had arrived from the south with his own demands, his own threats. Caught between 2 forces like grain between millstones, Ravenshollow faced a winter that would likely be its last. Elder Marcus had called the council meeting on the night the first snows began to fall. Evelyne remembered sitting in her small cottage, grinding herbs by candlelight, when young Tom burst through her door with barely concealed panic in his voice. "They want to see you at the hall, Evelyne, all the unmarried women. The elder says it's about survival." She had known then, with the clarity that comes from half a century of watching people make impossible choices, what Marcus intended. The blood auction had been outlawed for 3 generations, but laws meant little when extinction pressed close. The great hall had buzzed with nervous energy that night. Families clustered together, speaking in hushed voices, while unmarried women sat apart like sacrificial lambs. Sarah, Evelyne's closest friend since childhood, had reached across the gap between married and unmarried to squeeze her hand. "This is madness, Evie," Sarah had whispered, her weathered face creased with worry. "You're past 50. Who would want someone looking for a cook or a healer?" Evelyne had replied quietly. "Someone who values experience over youth." But they both knew the blood auction had never been about practical arrangements. It summoned things that fed on more than labor creatures, that sustained themselves on life force, on blood, on the essence of humanity itself. The old laws had forbidden it, because those who answered such calls rarely left their acquisitions alive for long. Elder Marcus had stood before the assembled village like a judge pronouncing sentence. His white beard trembled as he spoke, and his eyes could not quite meet those of the women he was offering up. "The old ways are harsh," he had said, his voice echoing in the stone hall. "But these are harsh times. Lord Blackwood demands 50 bushels of grain we don't have. Lord Aramis wants 30 head of cattle from our herds of 12. We can fight and die, or we can call upon those who might pay our debts for a different kind of price." The ritual itself was older than memory, passed down in whispered stories from grandmother to granddaughter. A platform of stone, blessed by ancient words that predated the village's founding church, a calling that reached into the dark places of the world, summoning those who walked in shadow and fed on mortal essence. 23 women had been presented that night. Most were young, their terror palpable as they understood what their neighbors were asking of them. But 3 were older widows like herself, who had outlived their usefulness in a community that measured worth by the ability to bear children and work the fields. Evelyne had volunteered. The decision had surprised everyone, including herself. But as she sat in that hall, watching young Mary weep silently while her own parents avoided her eyes, something had crystallized in Evelyne's mind. She had lost her husband to the plague 15 years ago. Her 2 children had followed him to the grave before they reached their 10th birthdays. She had spent the decades since then healing others, helping them bring life into the world and ease suffering from it. What did she have left to lose? "I'll stand for the village," she had said, rising from her bench with the dignity that came from years of facing death at bedsides and birthing chairs. "I've lived my life. Let the young ones live theirs." The relief in that hall had been palpable, though few would meet her eyes. Even Sarah had wept, whether from gratitude or grief, Evelyne could not tell. The preparation had taken 3 days. Ancient words had to be spoken. The platform consecrated with symbols that made the village priest cross himself and retreat to his church. Evelyne had spent those days setting her affairs in order, distributing her herbs and remedies to others who might use them, writing letters she would never send to family long dead. She had expected to die. The stories all ended the same way, with empty platforms and blood-stained stones, with creatures of darkness claiming their prizes and disappearing into the night. She had made her peace with it, even found a strange comfort in the idea that her death might have meaning. Standing on that platform as the mist rolled down from the mountains, feeling the weight of hungry eyes in the darkness beyond the torchlight, she had prepared herself for oblivion. What she had not prepared for was Lord Veyran's voice cutting through the night like a blade through silk, offering gold enough to save the village and asking nothing but her consent. What she had not prepared for was the sight of the most feared creature in 100 leagues kneeling before her on stones, still warm from her blood sacrifice. What she had not prepared for was the crack in her own heart as she realized that something, had looked at her and seen worth where her own people had seen only burden. The scream that had torn from her throat had not been fear. It had been the sound of something long buried, clawing its way back to life, the part of her that believed she mattered, that her voice held value, that her years of accumulated wisdom might yet serve a purpose. Now, as the obsidian carriage carried her through mountain passes shrouded in mist and legend, Evelyne found herself facing the most terrifying prospect of all. The possibility that her life was not yet over, that the story she thought had ended on that auction platform was only beginning. The legends painted Lord Veyran as a monster who had burned cities and drunk the blood of armies. But monsters, Evelyne knew from long experience, were rarely born. They were made by pain, by loss, by the slow erosion of hope, until only hunger remained. If that was true, then perhaps monsters could be unmade as well. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as she clutched her healing satchel and watched the familiar world fall away behind them, Evelyne felt something she had not experienced in 15 years of widowhood and exile from purpose. She felt necessary again. The auction had begun at the stroke of midnight, as tradition demanded. Torches ringed the platform where Evelyne stood, their flames casting dancing shadows that made the gathered crowd look like spectres themselves. The mist had rolled down from the mountains thick as wool, muffling sound and blurring the edges of reality, until the whole scene felt like something from a fever dream. Evelyne's hands had trembled at first, but she forced them still. She would not shame herself or her village by showing weakness now. The rough wool of her best dress, the same one she had worn to her husband's funeral, scratched against skin that had grown thin with age and worry. Her greying hair was bound back in a simple braid, no adornments save for the small silver cross her mother had given her 40 years past. She looked, she knew, exactly like what she was, a woman past her prime, worn by hardship, offering herself as the last resort of a desperate community. Elder Marcus stood beside the platform, his voice shaking as he spoke the old words, words that had not been uttered in living memory, but had been preserved in the careful script of the village's founding documents. The phrases felt foreign on his tongue, syllables that predated modern speech and carried the weight of darker times. "We call to those who walk in shadow," he intoned, the words barely audible above the wind. "We offer what we have, as our fathers offered before us, in the hope that mercy might temper justice and survival might follow sacrifice." The response came from the darkness beyond the torches, not words at first, but presence. The feeling of being watched, evaluated, judged by intelligences that existed outside the normal flow of time. Evelyne felt the hair on her arms rise as something vast and cold turned its attention toward the platform where she stood. Then came the voices. The first bid emerged from the eastern shadows, a sound like grinding stone that spoke of gold and iron, of labor in dark mines beneath the earth. The second came from the west, silky and smooth, promising luxury and comfort in exchange for services unspecified. A third voice joined from the south, offering protection for the village in exchange for what it called willing companionship. Each bid was higher than the last, the amounts climbing beyond anything Evelyne could comprehend. The village's debts could be paid 10 times over with what these creatures offered for the right to claim her. She stood frozen between terror and fascination, watching her own life become the subject of negotiation between forces she had never imagined. The voices grew more insistent, competing with each other in languages both familiar and strange. Some spoke in the common tongue, others in dialects that predated human civilization. The offers became more elaborate, more tempting, not just gold, but knowledge, power, the secrets of extending life or conquering death. Through it all, Evelyne remained silent. This was not her choice to make. She had offered herself. Others would decide her fate. That was when the fourth voice cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. "I claim her." The words were simple, spoken in accented common that carried traces of nobility from bygone eras. But the effect was immediate and profound. The other voices fell silent as if a door had been slammed shut on their offers. The very air seemed to thicken, and the torches flickered as though a wind had touched them, though the night was perfectly still. From the northern shadows stepped a figure that made Evelyne's breath catch in her throat. Lord Veyran looked nothing like the monster of legend. Tall and lean, he moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but his face bore the weight of centuries in its lines of weariness and regret. His dark hair was streaked with silver despite his apparent youth, and his pale eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge too dearly bought. He wore simple traveling clothes, dark wool and worn leather, but they could not disguise the aura of power that clung to him like morning mist. In his gloved hand he held a single gold coin. "I offer this," he said, his voice carrying easily across the square despite its quiet tone. "One piece of gold from the treasury of the forgotten kingdom of Valdris, minted in the reign of King Aldric the Just, blessed by the high priestess Lyanna before the fall of the Silver Tower." Elder Marcus stared at the coin as Veyran placed it on the edge of the platform. Even from her position above, Evelyne could see the intricate designs etched into its surface symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the torchlight, ancient magic made tangible. "That single coin," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with awe, "could buy grain for 5 years, cattle for 10. The entire debt of both armies could be paid, and still leave enough to build new granaries." The other bidders had fallen silent. Whatever forces had emerged from the darkness to compete for Evelyne's life, they recognized the significance of what Veyran offered. This was not merely payment, it was a statement, a claim that brooked no argument. Veyran stepped closer to the platform, and Evelyne found herself looking down into eyes that held centuries of pain. When he spoke again, his words were directed to her alone. "Evelyne Thorne," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I do not claim you. I ask for you. I do not demand your service. I request your aid. And I do not offer chains, but choice." The crowd stirred uneasily. This was not how the ritual was supposed to unfold. The blood auction was about power, about creatures of darkness taking what they desired from mortal flesh. It was not about requests or choices, or the gentle courtesy in Veyran's voice. Then he did something that shattered every expectation, every legend, every whispered story about the vampire lord of the northern mountains. He knelt. The sight of the most feared creature in the realm, dropping to one knee before a discarded village woman, struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Gasps echoed through the square, and more than one villager stepped backward as though witnessing something blasphemous. "I have walked in darkness for 3 centuries, Veyran said, his eyes never leaving Evelyne's face. "I have forgotten what it means to choose mercy over hunger, healing over harm. You are known throughout these mountains as a woman who brings life where others would bring death, who offers comfort where others would offer only judgment." His voice grew softer, more vulnerable. "I am tired, Evelyne Thorne. Tired of the monster I have become, tired of the isolation that comes with immortality, tired of existing without purpose or hope. I do not ask you to love me. I ask you to teach me how to love myself again. I do not ask you to redeem me. I ask you to show me how redemption might be possible." That was when the scream tore from Evelyne's throat. It was not the cry of a victim facing her fate. It was not the wail of a woman abandoned by her people. It was the sound of something breaking inside her, something that had been held too tightly for too long, something that had calcified around 15 years of grief and loss and the slow erosion of hope. For 3 decades, she had knelt beside sickbeds and held dying hands. She had whispered comfort to those who had no one else to hear their final words. She had delivered babies to mothers who could not care for them and tended wounds that would never fully heal. She had given and given and given until she had nothing left to offer but her own worn-out life. And now this creature, this vampire lord who could command armies and topple kingdoms, knelt before her and asked not for her blood or her service, but for her voice, her guidance, her wisdom. He saw her not as a burden to be disposed of, but as a teacher, not as worthless, but as valuable beyond measure. The scream that came from her was the sound of a heart that had forgotten how to hope, suddenly remembering. It was the cry of a woman who had thought her story was over, discovering that the most important chapter was just beginning. When the echoes faded, Veyran was still kneeling, still waiting, still offering her a choice that no one had given her in 20 years. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes." The word carried across the square like a benediction, and the ancient ritual was complete. The obsidian carriage moved through the mountain passes with impossible smoothness, as though it floated rather than rolled across the rocky terrain. Carved from a single piece of volcanic glass, it caught and reflected the moonlight in ways that made Evelyne's eyes water if she looked too long at its surface. The interior was lined with deep burgundy velvet that had somehow retained its richness despite what must have been centuries of use. Evelyne sat across from Veyran, her healing satchel clutched in her lap like an anchor to her former life. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably as the village fell away behind them, swallowed by mist and distance. She found herself studying his profile in the silver moonlight that filtered through the carriage windows, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his pale eyes reflected light like a cat's, the careful stillness that spoke of predatory patience. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, like the foxglove in her satchel, lovely to look at, but capable of stopping a heart with the wrong dosage. "You're afraid," he said without turning to look at her. His voice held no judgment, only quiet observation. "I would be foolish not to be," Evelyne replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Every story told about you ends in blood and ashes. Most of them are true." The admission came without defensiveness or pride, simply stated fact. "I have done terrible things, Evelyne. I will not lie to you about that, nor will I make excuses for choices that seemed necessary at the time, but were simply convenient." She considered this, watching the way shadows played across his features. What changed? For the first time since they had left the village, Veyran turned to face her fully. In the confined space of the carriage, she could see details that distance had hidden, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of weariness beyond his apparent years, the careful way he held himself as though afraid his very presence might contaminate her. "Time," he said simply, "3 centuries of existence stretching ahead like an endless winter. I realized that if I continued as I was, I would become nothing more than hunger wearing a man's shape. The thought of eternity spent as a monster became more terrifying than the prospect of trying to find my way back to something resembling humanity." "And you think I can help you do that?" Evelyne asked, genuine curiosity replacing some of her fear. "I'm a village healer, my lord. I tend scraped knees and difficult births. I know nothing of vampire curses or supernatural redemption." "You know how to heal," Veyran said, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. "Not just bodies, souls. I've heard stories, Evelyne, the way you sat with old Henrik through his final fever, reading to him from his wife's letters until he passed peacefully. How you talked young Willem out of hanging himself after his farm failed, helped him see that failure was not the same as worthlessness." Heat rose in Evelyne's cheeks. These were private moments, sacred exchanges between healer and patient. That he knew of them suggested he had been watching the village, watching her for longer than she had imagined. "Those were different," she protested. "Those were people who wanted to be helped. And what makes you think I don't?" The question was soft, almost vulnerable. "Do you believe monsters are incapable of wanting salvation, that the damned cannot dream of redemption?" The carriage hit a particularly rough patch of road, and Evelyne found herself gripping the velvet upholstery to keep from sliding across the seat. Veyran's hand moved as though to steady her, then stopped, his fingers curling back into his palm. "You're afraid to touch me," she observed. "I'm afraid of what my touch might do to you," he corrected. "I have not been in the company of a mortal for 30 years, Evelyne. I have forgotten how fragile human life can be, how easily it can be snuffed out by carelessness." There was something achingly lonely in that admission. Evelyne thought of her own isolation these past 15 years, the way people had begun to treat her as invisible once she could no longer bear children, the gradual erosion of purpose that had left her feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. But her loneliness was measured in years. His was measured in decades. "Where are we going?" she asked, partly to change the subject and partly because the question had been gnawing at her since they left the village. "Home," Veyran said, and then with a bitter smile, "or what remains of it. My castle lies in the high peaks, where the mist never fully clears and the sun reaches only a few hours each day." It's been my sanctuary and my prison for longer than some kingdoms have existed. Is it? Evelyne hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question diplomatically. Filled with the bones of my victims, decorated with instruments of torture? Veyran's smile held no humor. No. Whatever else I have become, I have never taken pleasure in suffering for its own sake. My kills were swift, my feeding efficient. I am a predator, not a sadist. The distinction seemed important to him, though Evelyne wasn't sure it made much difference to the dead. Still, she found herself oddly comforted by the idea that he drew lines, even arbitrary ones. The carriage began to climb more steeply, and through the windows, Evelyne could see they were ascending into country she had never visited. The trees grew taller here, ancient pines that blocked out the stars and seemed to whisper secrets to each other in the wind. The very air felt different, thinner, charged with something that made her skin prickle. "Tell me about your family," Veyran said suddenly, his voice gentle in the way one might use with a spooked animal. "Your husband, your children." The old pain twisted in Evelyne's chest, but it was duller now, worn smooth by years of carrying it. Thomas was a good man, a carpenter. He could make anything with his hands, cradles, coffins, the little toys our children played with. She smiled at the memory, surprised to find it brought warmth rather than agony. Margaret would have been 28 this year. She had my stubbornness and her father's gentle heart. Jonathan was the dreamer, always making up stories, always asking questions about how things worked. "The plague took them all?" Veyran asked quietly. "Within a week of each other. I tried everything I knew, called in every favor, begged every god whose name I remembered. Nothing worked." She looked down at her hands, still stained with decades of herb preparation. "I've never stopped wondering if there was something else I could have done." "Grief can be its own kind of immortality," Veyran observed. "A curse that keeps us bound to pain long after healing should have begun." Their eyes met in the dim light of the carriage, and Evelyne saw recognition there, the understanding of someone who had carried loss for so long it had become part of his very bones. Perhaps they were not so different after all. The castle appeared through the mist, like something from a dream, its towers reaching toward the stars, despite the ruin that had claimed much of its lower walls. It was beautiful and terrible, ancient and enduring, a monument to both glory and decay. "Welcome to Shadowmere," Veyran said as the carriage drew to a halt before the great entrance. "Welcome home." The mirror of memories dominated the great hall of Shadowmere like a silver lake, frozen in time, taller than two men and framed in obsidian that matched Veyran's carriage. Its surface rippled with images that shifted and changed as Evelyne watched. She saw glimpses of the castle as it once was, gleaming white stone, tapestries rich with gold thread, halls filled with laughter and music, and the warm glow of hundreds of candles. Then the images would shift, showing darker scenes, armies marching beneath crimson banners, cities burning on distant horizons, and through it all, a younger version of Veyran moving, like death incarnate across battlefields littered with the fallen. "Don't look too long," Veyran warned, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The mirror shows truth, but truth without context can be more damaging than lies." Evelyne forced herself to turn away from the mesmerizing surface, though the images continued to dance at the edges of her vision. The great hall was a study in contrasts, soaring arches that spoke of bygone grandeur, but walls where tapestries hung in tatters and centuries of neglect had left their mark. Dust motes danced in the pale light that filtered through stained glass windows, some panes missing entirely, others cracked in patterns that resembled spider webs. Yet for all its decay, Shadowmere possessed an austere beauty that took her breath away. This had once been the seat of power for an empire she could barely imagine, home to a man who had commanded the respect and fear of kingdoms. "How long since you've had human company here?" she asked, her voice small in the vast space. 37 years, Veyran replied without hesitation. A merchant who lost his way in a blizzard. I gave him shelter for 3 days until the storm passed, then escorted him safely to the lower roads. A pause. He was the last person I allowed myself to help. After that, I decided it was safer for everyone if I remained in isolation. Safer for them, or for you. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stood silhouetted against one of the broken windows, and for a moment he looked impossibly young despite the weight of centuries in his bearing. Both, he admitted finally. The hunger never truly leaves, Evelyne. It whispers constantly, reminding me how easy it would be to take what I need, rather than subsisting on what little I allow myself. Human company makes those whispers louder. She watched him carefully, noting the way his hands remained perfectly still at his sides, the controlled precision of every movement. Even in his own home, he held himself like a prisoner. "What do you feed on now?" The question was direct, perhaps impolite, but if she was to live here, she needed to understand the risks. "Animals, when the hunger becomes too strong to ignore," Veyran said, turning to face her. "Deer, mostly. Sometimes the wild boars that roam the higher peaks. It sustains the body, but not the soul, like eating bread. Made of sawdust, filling but ultimately hollow." Evelyne nodded, filing this information away. In her years as a healer, she had learned that understanding the nature of an ailment was the first step toward treating it. If she was to help him find his way back to humanity, she needed to understand exactly what that journey would entail. "Show me the rest," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. They moved through the castle like ghosts exploring a mausoleum. Room after room revealed the same patterned grandeur fallen into genteel decay, beauty marred by neglect, spaces too large for one solitary occupant. The library held thousands of books in dozens of languages, but many of the volumes had succumbed to dampness and time. The kitchens were vast enough to feed an army, but the hearths were cold, and the pantries empty, save for dust and spider webs. In what had once been a solar, Evelyne found evidence of Veyran's attempts to maintain some semblance of normal life. A desk stood before a window that looked out over the mountain peaks, its surface covered with correspondence in various states of completion. She glimpsed fragments of letters to merchants and scholars, carefully worded inquiries about the state of the world beyond his mountain fortress. "You've been trying to reconnect," she observed, touching one of the half-finished letters with gentle fingers. "Attempting to," Veyran corrected. "Most remain unfinished. I begin with good intentions, then remember what I am, and realize I have nothing worthwhile to say to the world of the living." In the mirror's reflection, she had seen him as he was a creature capable of terrible destruction. But here, surrounded by the evidence of his isolation and failed attempts at connection, she began to see something else, a man who had forgotten how to be human, but still remembered wanting to be. "The loneliness must be unbearable," she said softly. "Loneliness implies that one deserves companionship." Veyran replied, with bitter precision, "I prefer to think of it as appropriate consequence for poor choices." Evelyne turned to study him more closely. Even in the daylight filtering through the solar's windows, he moved with unconscious grace, every gesture economical and precise. But there was something fragile beneath the controlled exterior, like fine crystal that had been cracked but not yet shattered. "Penance and healing are not the same thing," she said, drawing on years of experience with patients who punished themselves more thoroughly than any external force ever could. "One is about payment for past wrongs. The other is about building something better from what remains." "And you believe healing is possible for someone like me?" The question was asked quietly, but Evelyne could hear the desperate hope underneath, carefully hidden but unmistakably present. It was the same tone she had heard from patients who feared their conditions were beyond treatment, but couldn't quite stop themselves from hoping. "I believe healing is always possible," she said firmly. The question is not whether you deserve it, the question is whether you're willing to do the work required to achieve it. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of possibility hanging between them. In the mirror's distant glow, Evelyne caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip, a vision of the castle as it could be, rather than as it was. Restored, filled with life and purpose, home to someone who had remembered how to hope. "I'll need a room close to the library," she said practically, breaking the spell of the moment. "And access to your gardens. I assume you still have gardens? I'll need to plant herbs if I'm to be of any real use to you." Something shifted in Veyran's expression, surprise, perhaps, or relief that she was speaking of the future as though it were certain. "The East Wing has chambers that receive morning light," he said, "and, yes, there are gardens, though they've run wild in my neglect." "Wild is often better," Evelyne said with the first real smile she had felt in years. "Wild things remember how to grow." The Thornwood staff had been waiting for her in the overgrown gardens, half hidden beneath a tangle of rose briars that had grown wild over decades of neglect. Carved from the heartwood of a blessed tree that had stood in these mountains for centuries, the walking stick bore symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. According to Veyran, it had belonged to Sister Miriam, a holy woman who had served as counselor to his human ancestors before the curse changed everything. Evelyne gripped the staff now as she made her way through the castle's corridors, using it both for support and as a reminder of the authority she was slowly claiming in this strange new life. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival at Shadowmere, and she had established routines with the determination of a woman who understood that structure was often the first step toward healing. Each morning, she rose before dawn to tend the gardens she was slowly reclaiming from wilderness. The work was hard on her aging joints, but satisfying in ways she had nearly forgotten. There was something deeply therapeutic about coaxing order from chaos, about seeing green shoots push through dark soil toward the light. Veyran often watched her work from the shadow of the castle's walls, never approaching close enough to interrupt, but never quite able to stay away. She could feel his presence like a cool breeze at the edge of perception, and gradually she had begun to understand that her simple human activities fascinated him in ways he seemed ashamed to admit. This morning was different. This morning, she intended to confront the destructive patterns that had kept him isolated for decades. She found him in the library, as had become his custom during the daylight hours. Surrounded by towers of books that reached toward the vaulted ceiling, he sat at a massive oak table that could have served as an altar in a cathedral. Before him lay an open volume bound in midnight blue leather, its pages covered with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't looking directly at them. "Still searching for a cure?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him with more confidence than she would have shown in those first uncertain days. "A solution," Veyran corrected without looking up. "Vampirism is not a disease to be cured, it is a fundamental alteration of one's very nature. But there are accounts of those who found ways to mitigate its effects." Evelyne studied the books scattered across the table's surface. Most were written in languages she couldn't read, but she recognized the desperate hunger behind the research. It was the same intensity she had seen in families whose children burned with fever, the frantic searching through every remedy and prayer in the hope of finding something, anything that might help. "How long have you been looking for this solution?" she asked. 47 years. The admission came quietly, as though he were confessing to some shameful weakness. "And in all that time, have you found anything that worked?" Veyran's fingers paused in their careful page-turning. "Small things, meditation techniques that quiet the hunger temporarily, rituals that allow me to subsist on less frequent feeding, ways to dull the predatory instincts that make normal interaction dangerous. But nothing that addresses the root problem." "No." Evelyne leaned back in her chair, letting the silence stretch between them. In her experience as a healer, the most important breakthroughs often came not from frantic searching, but from stillness, from creating space for understanding to emerge naturally. "What if you're asking the wrong question?" she said finally. This time Veyran did look up, his pale eyes sharp with interest. "Explain. You're a mutter, looking for ways to stop being what you are," Evelyne said, choosing her words carefully. "But what if the real question is not how to change your nature, but how to express that nature in ways that honor rather than destroy?" She saw understanding flicker across his features, followed immediately by resistance. "I am a predator, Evelyne, a creature that sustains itself by taking life from others. There is no honorable expression of that reality. Isn't there?" She reached across the table and touched the binding of one of his books, a treatise on ethics, written by a philosopher whose name she didn't recognize. "Humans are predators too, yet some choose to hunt only what they need and waste nothing of what they kill. Others find ways to sustain themselves that require no killing at all. You suggest I become a vegetarian vampire?" The question held bitter humor, but she could see he was listening. "I suggest you stop treating your nature as a curse, to be hidden, and start treating it as a responsibility to be managed." Evelyne's voice grew stronger as the idea took shape. "You have power, Veyran. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, supernatural abilities that could be used to protect rather than destroy. Instead of hiding from the world, why not find ways to serve it?" The resistance in his expression deepened. "You don't understand what you're asking. The hunger doesn't simply disappear because one chooses to be noble. It grows stronger with proximity to human life, more demanding with each act of restraint. Then we practice," Evelyne said simply, "the way a musician practices scales or a warrior practices with wooden swords before facing real blades. We start small. Build your tolerance gradually, create safeguards for when the hunger becomes too strong. And if I fail, if the predator takes control and I hurt you or someone else," the question hung in the air between them like an unsheathed blade. Evelyne could see the genuine terror in his eyes, not fear of death, but fear of becoming the monster he had fought so long to escape. "Then we learn from the failure and try again," she said with the calm certainty of someone who had seen patients take their first shaky steps after months of paralysis. "Healing is not a single moment of transformation, Veyran. It's a series of small victories and setbacks, each one teaching us something about how to do better next time." Before he could respond, a commotion arose from the castle's lower levels, the sound of horses and shouting voices that carried clearly through the ancient stone walls. Veyran was on his feet instantly, his body tensed with predatory alertness. "Someone approaches," he said, and she could hear the change in his voice, the careful humanity sliding away to reveal something older and more dangerous underneath. They moved to the library's great windows, and Evelyne felt her heart sink as she recognized the banners flying from the approaching riders' lances. The crimson wolf of Lord Blackwood's house snapped in the mountain wind, and behind it rode a full company of armed men. "They're coming for the village," she breathed, understanding immediately. The tribute Veyran's gold was supposed to pay, they must have decided it wasn't enough. Or worse, they had learned about the blood auction and come to investigate what they saw as supernatural interference in their affairs. "You could stop them," she said, turning to face Veyran. "With your power, your speed, you could protect Ravenshollow without anyone getting hurt." But even as she spoke, she could see the war being fought behind his eyes. The chance to use his abilities for good warred against decades of self-imposed isolation, against the fear that any action would inevitably lead to the old patterns of violence and death. This was the test she had known would come eventually, the moment when all their careful conversations about healing and redemption would collide with the harsh realities of the world beyond Shadowmere's walls. The bloodstone pendant had appeared around Veyran's neck 3 days after they decided to work together to protect the village. Evelyne had never seen him put it on, but there it hung, a crimson gem the size of a robin's egg that pulsed with its own inner rhythm, matching the beat of a heart that had stopped centuries ago. When she asked about it, he had grown uncomfortable, explaining only that it was a sign of deep connection, something that manifested when a vampire allowed another soul close enough to matter. She could feel it now, that strange resonance between them, as they moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward Ravenshallow. They travelled on foot, Veyran's supernatural speed allowing him to keep pace even when she had to pause to catch her breath on the steeper mountain paths. The pendant's glow provided just enough light to guide their way without alerting any sentries Blackwood might have posted. "Tell me again, why we're not simply confronting them directly," Evelyne whispered, as they crested the ridge that overlooked her former home. "Because direct confrontation is what the old Veyran would have done," he replied, his voice carrying easily despite its low volume. "I would have swept down from the castle, torn through their ranks like a wolf among sheep, and left enough blood-soaked earth to ensure no one challenged me again for decades." They crouched behind a stand of pine trees, studying the village below. Blackwood's men had made camp in the central square, their banners planted where the auction block still stood. Even from this distance, Evelyne could see the fear in the way the villagers moved, quick, furtive gestures, eyes that never quite met those of their uninvited guests. "But that would only create more problems," Veyran continued. "Word would spread that the vampire lord of Shadowmere had returned to his old ways. Other armies would come, larger ones, and eventually someone would succeed in destroying not just me, but everyone I tried to protect." It was a mature perspective, one that spoke to the growth she had been nurturing in him these past weeks. The old Veyran had thought only in terms of immediate dominance. This version considered consequences, thought several moves ahead, valued preservation over destruction. "So what's the alternative?" she asked. "We give them what they came for, but in a way that leaves everyone with their dignity intact." He pointed toward the northern edge of the village, where the granary stood. "Blackwood demands 50 bushels of grain. What would you say that building can actually hold?" Evelyne studied the structure, doing quick calculations based on her years of helping with harvest preparations. "Maybe 12 bushels, if they packed it tight. The village hasn't had a good harvest in 3 years. Then we ensure they have exactly what Blackwood demands, plus enough extra to see them through the winter." Veyran's smile held no trace of the predator she had first encountered at the auction. Instead, she saw something that looked remarkably like the satisfaction of a teacher whose student was finally grasping a difficult concept. "Magic?" she asked. "Multiplication," he corrected. "A simple matter of taking what exists and expanding its essential nature. The grain will be real, nutritious, indistinguishable from what they grew themselves. It simply won't have required the season of growth that normal grain demands." They worked together as the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn. Veyran's power flowed around the granary like invisible water, and Evelyne found herself serving as both anchor and amplifier for energies that made her skin tingle with otherworldly electricity. The bloodstone pendant grew warm against his chest as their efforts synchronized, until she could almost feel his heartbeat echoing in her own pulse. The transformation was subtle at first, sacs that had been limp, with emptiness slowly growing taut, the musty smell of the granary giving way to the sweet scent of fresh wheat. By the time the sun cleared the mountain peaks, the building was so full that grain spilled from its doorway in golden streams. "They'll be suspicious," Evelyne warned as they retreated to watch from their hiding place. "This much grain appearing overnight, it defies natural law." "Let them be suspicious," Veyran replied. "Suspicion without proof is just another word for wonder. And sometimes people need to be reminded that the world holds more mysteries than their daily experience suggests." The discovery played out exactly as they had anticipated. Blackwood's men found the overflowing granary just as the village was waking for morning chores. Evelyne watched through Veyran's enhanced vision as confusion gave way to careful gratitude among the villagers, while the soldiers muttered among themselves about supernatural intervention. Lord Blackwood himself emerged from the tavern where he had been sleeping, his face cycling through surprise, suspicion, and finally pragmatic acceptance. He was a practical man who had not survived decades of border warfare by questioning good fortune too closely. 50 bushels, as demanded, he declared loudly, ensuring his voice carried to every corner of the square. Plus, tribute for my restraint in not burning this miserable place to the ground. Load the wagons. We leave within the hour. But as his men began the work of loading their unexpected bounty, Blackwood's gaze turned toward the northern mountains, toward the peaks where Shadowmere waited in its shroud of perpetual mist. For just a moment, Evelyne thought she saw understanding in his expression, the recognition that forces beyond his control had acted to protect this village. Then, the moment passed, and he was simply a military commander overseeing the collection of tribute from a conquered territory. "He knows," Evelyne said, quietly. "Of course he knows," Veyran agreed. "Men like Blackwood don't survive by ignoring the supernatural, but knowing and being able to prove are very different things. As long as we don't give him concrete evidence of interference, he'll accept the grain and move on to easier targets." They remained hidden until the last of Blackwood's soldiers had disappeared down the mountain road, their wagons loaded with grain that would feed his army for months. Only then did they emerge from concealment, making their way down into the village that had once been Evelyne's home. The reception was mixed. Some villagers, particularly the older ones, who remembered stories of Shadowmere's protection in earlier times, offered cautious gratitude. Others, including Elder Marcus, seemed torn between relief and the fear that accepting supernatural aid might carry its own price. Sarah was among those who approached them, her weathered face creased with concern and affection in equal measure. "You look different, Evie," she said, studying her old friend with careful eyes. "Stronger, somehow. Like you've remembered something you thought you'd lost." "I have," Evelyne replied, glancing at Veyran, who stood slightly apart from the group, still maintaining the careful distance that had become his habit around mortals. "I've remembered what it feels like to be needed." The bloodstone pendant pulsed gently against Veyran's chest, and Evelyne felt an answering warmth spread through her own heart. Whatever was growing between them, partnership, friendship, something deeper, it was changing them, both in ways that went far beyond the supernatural. For the first time in decades, she began to believe that some curses could indeed become blessings, given time and the right kind of care. The Covenant scroll had been hidden in the deepest vaults of Shadowmere for 3 centuries, sealed away behind wards that Veyran himself had forgotten he'd placed. It was Evelyne who found it, drawn by instincts she didn't understand while searching for historical records about the castle's gardens. The parchment was made from something that wasn't quite animal skin, inscribed in letters that seemed to burn with their own cold fire. When she brought it to Veyran in the library, his face went ashen, a remarkable feat for someone whose skin hadn't held natural color in 300 years. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled in the way that meant he was fighting to contain something dangerous. "In the vault beneath the East Tower," Evelyne replied, settling into her customary chair across from his desk. "There's a hidden chamber behind the wine cellar. I was looking for seed stores and found I found a great many things, but this called to me most strongly." Veyran's hands trembled slightly as he unrolled the ancient parchment. The bloodstone pendant against his chest had begun to pulse faster, its crimson glow intensifying with each passing moment. Evelyne could feel the resonance between them shifting, becoming something sharper and more urgent. "Tell me what it says," she said when he remained silent for long minutes, his eyes scanning the otherworldly text. "It's a contract," Veyran said finally. written in the old tongue, sealed with blood magic that predates most kingdoms, a bargain struck between your ancestor and mine, generations before either of us was born. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that threatened to overturn everything they had built together. What kind of bargain? Evelyne asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would shatter the careful peace she had found at Shadowmere. Your family, the Thornes, were not simply healers. Veyran began, his voice growing steadier as he slipped into the role of historian. Your bloodline stretches back to the Order of the Silver Dawn, an organization of warrior priests dedicated to hunting creatures like myself. But not all of them were simple killers. Some understood that redemption was possible even for the damned. He looked up from the scroll to meet her eyes. Your great-great-grandmother, Lydia Thorne, was the most gifted among them. She had the ability to either destroy a vampire utterly or heal the spiritual wounds that created them in the first place. When my human ancestor, Lord Aldrich, was transformed against his will, she chose healing over destruction. The curse that made you barren, Veyran continued, and Evelyne felt the world tilt beneath her feet. It wasn't natural, Evelyne. It was a protective ward, passed down through the women of your line to prevent your power from manifesting until the right time. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Everything she had believed about herself, every moment of shame and inadequacy she had endured for being unable to bear children, had been built on a lie. Not a lie, exactly a protection she had never known existed. My children, she whispered, remembering Thomas and little Margaret and Jonathan, lost to plague 15 years ago. They were adopted, Veyran said gently. Thomas knew, though he never told you. The records are here, in the scroll. He loved you too much to burden you with the knowledge of what you truly were, and he loved the children as though they were his own blood. Tears burned behind Evelyne's eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. For the first time since losing her family, she felt a strange sense of completion rather than loss. Thomas had known her secret and chosen to build a life with her anyway. The children she had raised and loved had been hers in every way that mattered, even without the blood connection she had never known was impossible. But why now? She asked. Why is the ward lifting after all these years? Because you've made a choice that activates the deeper magic, Veyran said, and his expression grew troubled. The scroll details 2 possible outcomes when a Thorne bloodline heir encounters a vampire in need of redemption. You can complete the healing I've been seeking, permanently restore my humanity, and free me from the hunger that has driven me for 3 centuries. That sounds wonderful, Evelyne said, though something in his tone warned her there was more to come. Or, Veyran continued, the power can be turned to its original purpose. You could destroy me utterly, not just ending my existence, but ensuring that no trace of the vampire curse ever touches this land again. The choice hung between them like a sword suspended by spider silk. Everything they had built together, the growing trust, the careful partnership, the warmth that had begun to blossom between 2 souls who thought themselves beyond such connections, all of it balanced on the edge of this ancient magic. There's something else, Veyran said, his voice growing quiet. The power doesn't just affect me. Using it either way will fundamentally change you as well. If you choose healing, you become bound to me in ways that go far deeper than anything mortals typically experience. If you choose destruction, I become something like my ancestor, Evelyne finished, a hunter of supernatural creatures. More than that, Veyran said. You become the guardian of this region, charged with protecting it from all supernatural threats for the rest of your extended life. The power would keep you young and strong for centuries, but it would also isolate you from normal human connection. Evelyne leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a mantle she had never asked to wear. For 52 years, she had lived as an ordinary woman healer, wife, mother, widow. Now she learned that every moment had been leading to this choice, this moment when she would have to decide not just Veyran's fate but her own. "How long do I have to choose?" she asked. "The ward is already breaking down," Veyran said, and she could see the fear in his eyes, not fear of death, but fear that she would choose the path that would transform her into something beyond his reach. "The power is awakening in you whether you will it or not. By the next full moon, the choice will be made one way or another." As if summoned by his words, Evelyne became aware of something stirring deep within her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the library's hearth. Power, ancient and patient, beginning to unfurl like a flower that had been waiting decades to bloom. "There's one more thing," Veyran said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The bond we've formed, this connection that created the bloodstone pendant, it means that whatever you choose will affect not just my nature, but yours as well. If you heal me, you take on some of my darkness. If you destroy me, you take on some of my isolation." "And if I choose neither?" Evelyne asked. "If I try to walk away from this choice entirely?" "Then the power tears you apart from the inside," Veyran said with brutal honesty. "Your bloodline was shaped for this purpose, Evelyne. Fighting it would be like trying to dam a river with your bare hands." She rose from her chair and walked to the library's great windows, looking out over the mountain peaks that had become her new home. Somewhere below, Raven Shollow continued its daily struggle for survival, protected now by grain that had appeared through supernatural intervention. The village that had abandoned her was safe because she had chosen to help the monster who claimed her. But was she helping him toward redemption, or toward a more subtle form of damnation? "Tell me honestly," she said without turning around. "If our positions were reversed, if you held my life in your hands and had to choose between saving me or destroying me, what would you do?" "I would find a third option," Veyran said immediately. "I would tear apart heaven and earth looking for a way to save you without the cost the scroll demands." "Then that's what we'll do," Evelyne said, turning back to face him. "We have until the full moon to find another way. And if we can't, then I'll trust your judgment," Veyran said. "Whatever choice you make, I'll accept it gladly, knowing it comes from someone who sees me as more than the monster I was." The power stirred again in her chest, impatient with their delay. But Evelyne had spent 50 years learning that the best healing often took time, patience, and the willingness to look beyond obvious solutions. She had 3 weeks to save them both. The silver chalice had emerged from the deepest vaults of Shadowmere 3 days before the full moon, drawn to the surface by the same awakening power that now coursed through Evelyne's veins like liquid starlight. Carved from a single piece of blessed silver and inscribed with symbols that predated written language, the cup seemed to pulse with its own inner radiance, offering either salvation or damnation depending on how it was used. Evelyne held it now as she stood in the castle's highest tower, watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks while Veyran searched through the last of his ancient texts below. The chalice was warm to the touch despite the silver, and she could feel the weight of centuries pressing against her consciousness, whispers of all the choices that had led to this moment. The power within her had grown stronger each day, no longer content to remain dormant. She could sense life forces throughout the castle, and beyond the flutter of bats in the rafters, the heartbeat of mice in the walls, the strange, cold pulse that marked Veyran's undead existence. More disturbing still, she could feel the hunger that gnawed at him constantly, the supernatural need that no amount of animal blood could fully satisfy. For 3 weeks, they had searched desperately for an alternative to the choice the Covenant Scroll demanded. They had sent letters to scholars throughout the realm, consulted with hermit mages who lived in mountain caves, even attempted to contact the spirits of long-dead priests who might remember the original binding. Every avenue had led to the same conclusion. The magic that shaped her bloodline allowed for only 2 paths forward. heal the vampire and bind herself to his darkness, or destroy him and accept the isolation that came with her guardian's power. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent her entire life healing others, only to discover that her greatest act of healing might require her to embrace the very darkness she sought to eliminate. Any luck with the translations? She called down to where Veyran worked by lamplight in the library below. "Nothing we haven't seen before," came his reply, tinged with the exhaustion that had marked his efforts these past days. Every reference to the Silver Dawn Order mentions the same limitation: their power was absolute, but inflexible. They could save or damn, but never both, and never neither. Evelyne descended the spiral stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the ancient stone walls. The castle felt different now, that her power was awakening less like a tomb and more like a living thing, its stones humming with memories of all who had walked these halls. She could sense the lingering presence of Veyran's human ancestors, the fear and desperation of those who had made the original bargain that bound their bloodlines together. She found him hunched over a desk, scattered with books in languages she couldn't read, the bloodstone pendant casting crimson shadows across pages of careful notes. He looked up as she approached, and she saw her own exhaustion reflected in his pale eyes. "There has to be another way," he said, though his voice carried little conviction. "The magic that created vampires in the first place, surely there must be some method of undoing it that doesn't require such absolutes." "Perhaps there is," said a new voice from the library's entrance, causing both of them to turn in surprise. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that held depths of knowledge earned through centuries of study. He wore robes that seemed to shift between grey and white, depending on the angle of view, and in his hand he carried a staff topped with a crystal that pulsed with inner light. "Brother Augustin," Veyran breathed, rising from his chair with something approaching reverence. "I thought you were dead." "Reports of my demise have been greatly exaggerated," the newcomer replied with a slight smile. "Though, I must admit, maintaining this existence has required considerable effort since our last meeting." Evelyne felt the power within her react to the stranger's presence, recognizing something familiar yet dangerous in his aura. "You're one of them," she said. "The Silver Dawn Order, the last of them, I fear, Augustin, acknowledged with a bow. I have spent the past 3 centuries in meditation and study, seeking to understand the flaws in our original approach. When I felt your power beginning to awaken, I knew the time had come to offer what wisdom I have gained." "You've been watching us," Veyran said, and there was a dangerous edge to his voice that reminded Evelyne of the predator he still was beneath the careful humanity they had built together. "Observing," Augustin corrected, "and marveling at what you have accomplished together. In all my years of study, I have never seen a vampire choose restraint over indulgence so consistently, nor a Thorne heir develop their power through compassion rather than duty." He moved closer to examine the silver chalice that Evelyne still held. "This is what convinced me that a third path might indeed be possible. The chalice was meant to hold either the blood of the damned or the tears of the redeemed. But what if it were to hold both? Evelyne and—" Veyran exchanged glances. "Explain," she said. "The original magic assumes that vampirism and humanity are opposites, that one must be chosen over the other," Augustin said, settling into a chair with the careful movements of someone far older than he appeared. "But you two have proven that assumption false. You, Lord Veyran, have maintained your humanity despite your supernatural nature, and you, Lady Evelyne, have embraced your power without losing your compassion." "What are you suggesting?" Veyran asked. "A synthesis," Augustin replied. "Instead of choosing between healing and destruction, between binding and freedom, what if you were to choose transformation for both of you, not into monster or hunter, but into something new, beings who exist at the balance point between human and supernatural, capable of bridging both worlds?" The idea hung in the air between them like a rope thrown across a chasm, offering hope, but requiring a leap of faith that might end in destruction. "What would that look like?" Evelyne asked, her voice carefully steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "You would both become something unprecedented," Augustin said. "Veyran would retain his immortality and supernatural abilities, but the hunger would be replaced by a different kind of sustenance, one drawn from the healing and protection you provide to others. Evelyne, your power would be fully awakened, but instead of binding you to solitary guardianship, it would bind you to him in true partnership." "And the cost?" Veyran asked, because in his experience, powerful magic always demanded a price. "You would be tied to this land forever," Augustin said honestly. "Your existence would become inseparable from the protection and guidance of these mountains and the people who dwell within them. You would have each other, but you would also have responsibility that could never be abandoned." Evelyne felt the silver chalice grow warm in her hands, as though responding to the possibility Augustin had outlined. The power within her chest stirred with what felt like recognition, as though this path had always been intended but required the right catalyst to reveal itself. "How do we do it?" she asked. "The ritual must be performed at the moment of the full moon's peak," Augustin said, consulting a small journal he produced from his robes. "Both of you must freely choose this path, without coercion or desperation, but from genuine desire to serve something greater than yourselves. The chalice must be filled with water from the sacred spring that feeds this castle's wells, blessed with words that acknowledge both the darkness you embrace and the light you seek to maintain. And if we're wrong," Veyran asked, "if this synthesis Augustin proposes is impossible and we destroy ourselves in the attempt?" "Then we will have tried," Evelyne said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "I have spent too much of my life accepting limitations that others imposed on me. I won't do the same with limitations imposed by ancient magic." She looked at Veyran, seeing in his expression the same resolve that had driven her to volunteer for the blood auction in the first place. "We have built something good together here, something that neither of us could have achieved alone. If there's a chance we can make that permanent, shouldn't we take it? Even knowing the risks." "Especially knowing the risks," she said firmly. "The best healing often requires accepting uncertainty in exchange for the possibility of something better." Augustin rose from his chair, his ancient eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like hope. "Then we have 2 days to prepare. The ritual itself is complex, but the most important element is the intention you bring to it. You must be absolutely certain this is what you choose, not as an escape from the alternatives the scroll presents, but as the path you actively desire." As the monk departed to begin his own preparations, Evelyne and Veyran found themselves alone in the library once more. The bloodstone pendant pulsed gently against his chest, and she could feel the resonance between them stronger than ever. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But yes, I'm certain. Are you?" Veyran's smile held all the warmth she had come to treasure in their weeks together, along with something deeper, a love that had grown gradually from respect to partnership to something neither of them had expected to find. "I have been dead for 3 centuries, he said. "If there's a chance to finally live again, truly live, with purpose and connection and hope, then yes, I choose that risk." The silver chalice seemed to sing in her hands, and Evelyne felt the power within her settle into patterns of readiness. Tomorrow night would bring either their transformation or their destruction. Either way, they would face it together. The dawn blade materialized in the sacred grove behind Shadowmere as the full moon reached its zenith, rising from the earth like a sword of crystallized starlight. Its appearance was not summoned by any ritual or incantation, but by the convergence of ancient powers that had been building toward this moment for 3 centuries. The weapon pulsed with holy radiance, neither fully solid nor entirely ethereal, representing the choice between destruction and mercy that would define the next few minutes. Evelyne stood at the center of the grove, the silver chalice filled with blessed spring water, held steady in her hands, despite the supernatural energies that made the very air crackle with potential. The power within her had reached its peak, no longer content to remain dormant. Every nerve in her body sang with otherworldly strength, and she could feel the weight of generations pressing against her consciousness, all the women of her bloodline who had faced similar moments of absolute choice. Veyran knelt before her as he had at the auction platform, but this time the gesture carried different meaning. Not submission, but trust. Not desperation, but acceptance of whatever outcome their shared courage might bring. The bloodstone pendant against his chest blazed like a captive star, and through its connection she could feel his certainty, his love, his willingness to face transformation or dissolution if it meant she might find peace. Brother Augustine stood at the edge of the grove, his ancient voice carrying the words of a ritual that had never been attempted before, phrases that wove together the language of healing and binding, of destruction and creation, of endings that were also beginnings. The incantations felt familiar despite their novelty, as though the magic itself was teaching them how to proceed. But they were not alone in the grove. The enemy that had orchestrated the blood auction, that had manipulated events to bring them to this moment, finally revealed himself as the moon reached its absolute peak. Brother Matthias emerged from shadows that should not have existed in the moon's full radiance, his face a twisted mirror of Augustine's wisdom. Where Augustine carried the staff of measured knowledge, Matthias bore chains that sang with binding magic, tools meant to ensure that ancient laws remained unchanged. "You cannot be allowed to succeed," Matthias declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent centuries enforcing the rigid boundaries between supernatural and human worlds. The Order of the Silver Dawn was founded on absolutes for good reason. Compromise leads to corruption. Half measures lead to damnation. "The old ways have failed," Augustine replied calmly, never pausing in his recitation of the transformation ritual. 3 centuries of rigid enforcement have brought us only more monsters, more isolation, more fear. These two have proven that a different path is possible. Matthias raised his free chains, and Evelyne felt the power within her recoil as binding magic reached toward her like grasping fingers. But the dawn blade pulsed brighter, and she understood instinctively that the weapon existed not to destroy Veyran, but to cut through the limitations that others would impose on their choice. "You were my student once," Matthias said to Augustine, and his voice carried genuine grief. "I taught you that some boundaries exist to protect the world from chaos. What will happen when every vampire claims they seek redemption, when every monster demands the right to transformation rather than accepting the justice of destruction? Then we will judge each case on its own merits," Evelyne said, her voice carrying new authority as the power within her reached its crescendo. "Just as we would with any other soul seeking healing." She lifted the silver chalice toward the moon, and the blessed water within began to glow with the same radiance as the dawn blade. Through her connection with Veyran, she could feel his vampire nature responding to the ritual, not fighting against transformation, but embracing it, ready to become something new, rather than clinging to the familiar patterns of hunger and isolation. "The choice is ours to make," Veyran said, his eyes never leaving Evelyne's face. "Not yours, Brother Matthias, not the Order's, ours." The binding chains lashed toward them like striking serpents, but the dawn blade moved of its own accord, positioning itself between the weapon of enforcement and the couple who refused to accept the limitations of ancient law. Light met darkness in a clash that sent ripples through the fabric of reality itself, and Evelyne felt the moment of decision rushing toward them like an avalanche. The ritual Augustine chanted was reaching its culmination, the words building to a crescendo that would either transform them both or destroy them utterly. The power within her demanded release, demanded choice, demanded that she finally step into the destiny that had been shaped for her across generations of careful breeding and magical preparation. Through the bloodstone pendant's connection, she felt Veyran's absolute trust, his willingness to follow her into whatever unknown territory their choice might create. And in that trust, she found the courage to embrace not just healing or destruction, but the possibility of synthesis that Augustine had offered. Together, she whispered, and raised the silver chalice toward the peak of the full moon's light. The heartstone manifested at the moment Evelyne chose love over vengeance, appearing in the space between her hands and the silver chalice like a crystallized promise. No larger than a robin's egg, but containing depths that seemed to hold entire galaxies, it pulsed with the rhythm of a heart that had been slowly regenerating through months of acceptance and hope. This was Veyran's humanity made tangible, not the humanity he had lost 3 centuries ago, but the new version they had built together through patience and trust. "I choose healing," Evelyne declared, her voice carrying across the grove with the authority of absolute certainty. "Not the healing that destroys what it touches, but the healing that transforms it into something better." The power within her surged toward the heartstone, and through the bloodstone pendant's connection, she felt Veyran's vampire nature responding not with resistance, but with relief. For 300 years, he had carried the hunger like a poison in his veins, defining himself by his restraint rather than his choices. Now, as silver light from the chalice merged with the crimson glow of the heartstone, that fundamental hunger began to shift into something else entirely. Brother Matthias's binding chain struck against the dawn blade again, sending shockwaves through the grove that made ancient trees shiver and caused the very stones to sing with otherworldly harmonies. But the weapon of enforcement could not touch what was happening between Evelyne and Veyran. Their transformation existed outside the rigid categories that Matthias sought to maintain. "This is abomination," he cried, his face twisted with the fervor of someone whose entire worldview was crumbling before his eyes. The boundaries between human and monster exist for protection. Without them, chaos will consume everything. "The only chaos here," Augustine said, his ritual chanting never faltering despite the supernatural battle raging around them, "is your refusal to accept that love can accomplish what force cannot." The heartstone rose from Evelyne's palms, hovering between her and Veyran as the transformation reached its critical moment. She could feel the change beginning in her own body, not the violent alteration that created vampires, but something gentler and more profound. The power that had awakened in her bloodline was merging with Veyran's supernatural nature, creating a synthesis that had never existed before. Her mortality began to stretch and expand, not into undeath, but into something that existed between life and eternity. The knowledge of healing that had taken her 50 years to accumulate deepened and broadened, enhanced by supernatural insight that allowed her to perceive the spiritual wounds that lay beneath physical ailments. Veyran's transformation was equally profound. The hunger that had driven him for centuries dissolved like ice in spring water, replaced by a different kind of sustenance, one drawn from the healing they provided to others, from the protection they offered to those who needed sanctuary. His vampiric strength and speed remained, but they were no longer tools of predation, they became instruments of service. The bloodstone pendant flared one final time and then shattered, its purpose complete. But instead of loss, they felt a deeper connection, forming not the artificial bond of magical artifact, but the natural harmony of two. Souls who had chosen to become something greater than either could achieve alone. Matthias made one final desperate attempt to stop the transformation, his binding chains reaching directly for the heartstone that held the key to their synthesis. But the Dawn Blade moved to intercept him, and in the collision between enforcement and choice, between rigid law and compassionate innovation, the weapon of absolute judgment finally shattered. "You have doomed us all," Matthias whispered, as his chains crumbled to dust, and his power to enforce the old boundaries died with them. "We have given you a new beginning," Evelyne replied, and her voice now carried harmonics that spoke to both human and supernatural understanding. "The choice you feared to make is the same choice we offer to every soul who seeks redemption, the chance to become something better than what you were." The ritual reached its completion as the heartstone settled gently into the blessed water of the silver chalice. The convergence of their transformations sent ripples of change throughout the surrounding mountains, touching every supernatural creature that dwelled in shadow, and offering them the same possibility that Veyran had chosen. They were no longer vampire and human, predator and healer, monster and saint. They had become something new, guardians who existed at the balance point between worlds, capable of understanding both the hunger that drove the damned and the hope that sustained the faithful. As the moon began its descent toward the western peaks, Evelyne felt the weight of their new responsibility settling around them like a mantle woven from starlight and shadow. They were bound now not just to each other, but to the land itself and all who sought sanctuary within its borders. But unlike the isolation that had marked Veyran's previous existence, this binding felt like freedom. They would serve together, heal together, face whatever challenges the future might bring as partners, who had chosen love over fear, synthesis over destruction, hope over despair. The heartstone pulsed one final time in the silver chalice, and their transformation was complete. The wedding ring of starlight appeared on Evelyne's finger 3 months after the transformation, manifesting during the spring planting as she knelt in the gardens of Shadowmere beside Veyran, their hands deep in soil that had never known such abundance. Forged from celestial metal that existed only when two souls chose each other freely across the boundaries of mortality and eternity, the ring caught and held light from sources that had nothing to do with sun or moon. On Veyran's hand, a matching band had formed, not silver or gold, but something that seemed to shift between the two, depending on the angle of view. Together, the rings created a harmony that resonated through their shared connection, a constant reminder of the choice they had made and continued to make each day. Ravenshollow had prospered beyond recognition in the months since their transformation. What had begun as supernatural intervention, the mysteriously multiplied grain that saved the village from Lord Blackwood's demands, had evolved into something more sustainable. Crops grew with unusual vigor in fields that Evelyne blessed with her transformed healing power. Livestock remained healthy even during harsh weather. Children who had been weak with malnutrition grew strong and bright-eyed. But more than physical prosperity, the village had gained something it had never possessed before: hope. People no longer spoke in whispers about the vampire lord of the northern mountains. Instead, they told stories of the Guardian and his lady, protectors who watched over the high country with wisdom, earned through centuries of experience and compassion, learned through decades of service. "The delegation from Lord Aramis will arrive by midday," Veyran said, brushing soil from his hands as he stood. His movements held the fort, same fluid grace they always had, but there was something different now. A purposefulness that came from knowing exactly why he existed and what he was meant to accomplish. "Let them come," Evelyne replied, continuing to plant the medicinal herbs that would form the backbone of her expanded healing practice. "We'll listen to their demands and find solutions that serve everyone's interests. The old ways of tribute and conquest serve no one in the long run." The transformation had changed her in ways both subtle and profound. Her hair had regained some of its youthful luster, though it remained silver at the temples, a mark of the wisdom she had earned through 5 decades of mortal experience. Her hands, once marked by age and hard work, now moved with supernatural precision while retaining the gentleness that had made her such an effective healer. More importantly, she had gained the ability to perceive the spiritual ailments that often lay beneath physical symptoms. When people came to her for healing, and they came now from villages throughout the mountain region, she could see not just their illnesses, but the fears, regrets, and broken connections that contributed to their suffering. They had established new traditions at Shadowmere, patterns of service that drew on both their natures. Once each month, on the night of the new moon, they opened the castle's great hall to anyone seeking sanctuary or guidance. Former enemies sat beside old friends, supernatural creatures shared space with mortal families, and conflicts that had simmered for generations found resolution through patient dialogue. The mirror of memories had become a tool of healing rather than mere reflection. Under Evelyne's guidance, people could confront their past traumas safely, seeing their experiences in context rather than being overwhelmed by raw emotion. Veyran's centuries of accumulated wisdom provided perspective on struggles that seemed insurmountable to those living through them for the first time. Sarah's coming up the mountain path, Veyran observed, his enhanced senses detecting the approach of Evelyne's oldest friend long before normal sight would have revealed her. Evelyne looked up from her planting with genuine pleasure. Sarah had been among the first villagers to overcome her fear of Shadowmere's supernatural inhabitants, and her monthly visits had become a cherished connection to the woman Evelyne had been before her transformation. "She's bringing someone with her," Evelyne noted, her own enhanced perception picking up the presence of a stranger, young female, carrying the psychic scent of desperation that marked someone in desperate need of help. They had dealt with many such cases in recent months. Word of their unique sanctuary had spread throughout the region, drawing people who existed at the margins of normal society, those cursed by magic, haunted by guilt, or simply unable to find acceptance in conventional communities. Shadowmere had become a place where transformation was possible for anyone willing to do the work required. "Another refugee from the normal world," Veyran said with the gentle humor that had become characteristic of their new existence. "I wonder what impossible problem we'll be asked to solve this time." "There are no impossible problems," Evelyne replied, echoing words that had become something of a motto for their work together. "Only solutions we haven't discovered yet." As Sarah crested the rise with her young companion, a girl who couldn't be more than 16, her clothes torn and her eyes wild with the kind of fear that came from being hunted, Evelyne felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had driven her throughout both her mortal life and her transformed existence. The girl was clearly supernatural in some way, probably newly transformed and struggling to control abilities she didn't understand. Her presence would bring challenges, complications, possibly even danger. But it would also bring the opportunity to extend the same acceptance and guidance that had allowed Evelyne and Veyran to find their way back from the edge of despair. "Welcome to Shadowmere," Evelyne called out, rising from her garden to greet the newcomers. The wedding ring of starlight caught the afternoon sun and threw patterns of light across the ground like promises written in illumination. "We're so glad you found us." Behind her, Veyran's quiet laughter carried on the mountain wind, not the bitter sound of a creature who had forgotten how to hope, but the warm expression of someone who had remembered that the best stories never really end. They just begin new chapters. Together, they walked toward whatever challenge and opportunity their visitors would bring, partners in purpose as well as in love, guardians not just of the mountains, but of the possibility that anyone, no matter how lost, could find their way home.